Leadership is not a title, it's an action. And a lot of people are leaders that don't have the leadership title, right? It's in what they do on a day-to-day basis with people, and not necessarily that their title says they're a chief HR officer.
Okay, folks, this is Amplified, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Toni, welcome to the virtual studio.
Thank you for having me, MK.
I appreciate you making the time. You are now a part of a good cohort of very senior HR professionals that I've been bringing into the podcast to have conversations, not just about the topic of leadership, but also talent acquisition and maybe some of the challenges that folks are experiencing in the HR space. But the name of the podcast is Leadership, so we're going to start with that topic and maybe talk a little bit about your background and leadership experiences. I will start off by asking you a question that I've become a fan of, and that is, when was the first time in your career that you recognized and or worked for someone that you thought, wow, that person's an outstanding leader, and I may want to draw from and or take from what I'm seeing from that person?
That's a great question. I think probably early on, the first one that comes to mind, and there were many, so I was really fortunate in that regard, but the first one that comes to mind was when I actually entered the world of banking and finance, which I didn't start in the HR space. I started in banking and finance and worked for a really good CEO who had a high EQ. And some really good leadership skills, and really grew people, around him. It was a good opportunity.
What aspects of his, specifically the EQ, since you mentioned it, what aspects of it like resonated for you that you saw day in and day out that were like, those are great qualities to have, and I see what kind of impact it has on people?
Mm-hmm. I think that he focused as much on the people portfolio as he did the loan portfolio. Remember, we're in banking, so banking geeks, right? And he really understood the value and importance of both of those and knew that without one, you didn't have the other. But he had a really good way of asking the right questions at the right times with people, and a good way of not providing the answers, but allowing people to come to the answer on their own. And in that way, people really learn, right? Otherwise, you're just answering questions. But that's the way in which you build and develop people, is asking those good questions. And I always found them intriguing. And I always tell the story of, he asked me one time, and now, mind you, I was younger much at the time, but he asked me in a review, he said, what do you want? What do you want to do? And me being bold as I was at the time, I said, well, I want a seat at the table. And he said, earn it. And I said, okay. And he did give me that seat at the table eventually.
That's outstanding.
Yeah. It was great.
Have you taken those lessons and learnings, and then subsequently, do you incorporate that kind of style into your own leadership? That's got a little bit of a leading question. I assume the answer is yes. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how you incorporate that style?
Leading the witness, yes. So yes, I do a lot of that, and I think people who work directly on my team would tell you the same thing. They would say often, especially if they were in the early days with me. They would say, hey, I know that you're going to ask me a question, or you're going to answer my question with a question. I said, probably. But you also have to, be thoughtful enough to understand that sometimes they don't have the answer, and they can't get to it, right? And pick out those little things. But I think servant leadership was my way, and that's the way for a lot of people, and I know that's a line that people use, often and a lot. But at the end of the day, people have to want to follow you, not because of my title, because I say this often in our group, and to anyone that will hear me, and it's kind of my tagline in the workplace is that leadership is not a title, it's an action. And a lot of people are leaders that don't have the leadership title. Right. It's in what they do on a day-to-day basis with people, and not necessarily that their title says they're a chief HR officer.
Right. As you look across the industry, I'm sure that you have lots of conversations with colleagues in the space.
Mm-hmm.
But where are we succeeding and where are we failing with developing leaders? Like, what have you seen across the board that gives you encouragement, i.e., maybe it's an investment of time, leadership programs that exist within enterprise organizations. So those good things, and then maybe what you hope that we can start leaning into in the leadership realm.
Let me see. What I think that we're getting right are some of the programs that are focusing more on EQ and competencies, and the speed of trust is one of my favorite things. We all love Covey, right?
Yeah.
And I think that if you can build
still, by the
still,
way,
yes.
I mentioned Covey's name to someone one time, and this was like a decade ago, and they told me I was out of sync with the times, and I was like, this is perennial. This is evergreen information here. What do you mean?
You could not be more right. You could not be more. When it works, right?
Right.
We don't break something that works. But I do think that customization of leadership programs rather than getting them off the shelf. So we know that there are some things that work. We just talked about Covey and the speed of trust and some of those types of things. But I think that more organizations, especially the larger ones that have the bandwidth, are now customizing their leadership programs rather than, there are a lot of them that I could name. I won't do that, we can go get, and you can pull it off the shelf, and perhaps you can make it work for your organization. But I think customizing leadership is something that I'm seeing more and more of. And I think that I like that a lot. I also like the fact that it's coming down into the middle management space. I think that leadership used to be, something that was really reserved for, the top of the house.
Executives, the C-suite, right?
And in my opinion, that's too late, right? To get the toolbox. If you're already at the top of the house, you kind of miss the tools on the way. But I think that most organizations now are also pushing that down further into those, even first management spaces. And certainly I applaud them for doing that and having the foresight to do that, getting those tools in front of them faster.
So before you go on to what we maybe aren't doing right, so my company, we do leadership delivery and training as an external organization to enterprise, specifically the small to medium sized business space. But what I heard you say is that you like seeing how some entities do this in house and develop their own programs. Is that a fair statement?
I think let me quantify that or qualify that or clarify that maybe is a better word. I have seen and am seeing, whether it's with groups like yours, and I've looked at some of the work that your groups are doing, which is fantastic, by the way, but I think more organizations are reaching out to groups like yours, to local universities, partnering with people like your organization and others to bring in something that's custom and not just move forward with this is something packaged that we can bring in, which is what your organization does. You might have a framework, but you're customizing that likely to the organization.
Yeah, I liken it to meeting the customer where they are. I don't think that you can
absolutely
pre-package anything too much, but certainly, as you indicated, we have a methodology and a framework that we use, but we have to leave ourselves space and also leave the customer space to basically identify the areas that they want to see that return on investment. Like, this is what I want you to concentrate on and spend time on. And when you combine what it is that they're looking for in terms of what we want to deliver, I think that's a sweet spot to identify. So, what about what we're not getting right in the space across industry as it relates to leadership development?
People, and I know that seems maybe that's not the answer that you were anticipating. Here's what I think.
Elaborate, please.
Often people, will come to you and come into my office or want to have a conversation with me and others and say, I want to be in management. Which really you have to peel the onion back on that. So my point is, it's the old adage, but we're still doing it, is putting people who are really great at what they do in leadership positions, and they don't have leadership skills. Some of those can be taught and finessed, right? And we can give them tools such as your organization and others can do. But we also know that there are some of those things that are inherent, those competencies that are there, and for leadership to really be able to shine with those individuals. And it's just still too often we put people in leadership positions that are great people, but should not be there.
So I'm starting to believe very clearly that is a human fallacy, like that we across the board assume that someone with a particular skill set can also train and teach that skill set to other people. I mean, it happens across the board. It happens in professional sports. There have been across the ages some superstar athletes who've gone into coaching and they've been not too good at coaching. There are some coaches, oddly enough, who've never played the sport, who are some of the greatest leaders of all time that have been able to motivate. When you get to the core of it, leadership's about motivating people towards a common objective, right? And the skills that you employ to do that sometimes come from very, very different places. It's about making that connection, building that trust, as you indicated. But I'm the reason I'm focusing in on this is because I come from the technology space, and one of the complaints I have about having now spent a decade plus in the technology space is that I see so much of this, like great technologists, people who are great at doing whatever specific task it is that they were hired to do, be elevated to leadership roles, and they have no bearings whatsoever when it comes to leading people and or motivating them. They just happen to be great coders, great web designers, great at whatever it is that they do from a technical standpoint. Right. And it's not that they can't develop those skills. I just think that it's a human fallacy to assume that people come ready-made with those skills, which is a challenge that I see across the board. That assumption, I think, gets us in trouble. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I'm sorry that I was interrupting you, but I think assessment is also the other piece that's missing and we don't get right. The assessment that we're using right now, to the point that you kind of just made, is, well, gosh, MK's, he's our very best coder and he's been with us for, 12 years. So let's put him in the leadership program. Was there any type of assessment prior to that decision? And or did you sit down and have a conversation with that person? I've had someone come to me, an organization I was with a long time ago, and they came to my office and they said, so-and-so came to talk to me and they're going to put me in this leadership program and, consider me for, to run this group. And I said, that's fantastic. Congratulations. They said, I don't want to do it.
And were they willing to tell the company that they didn't want to do it?
So we walked through how to have that conversation, but sometimes not even that conversation. I think sometimes that's an assumption, and it's not for everyone because it's not easy, right?
Yeah.
The people part is hard, but most rewarding.
No, it's the hardest part, and you actually bring up an interesting point. Not only are there people, I think, who would probably tell you, I don't want to do that because I know myself, and they just, they say that that's probably not the best fit for their skills and capabilities, don't want the responsibility. I actually admire that when people readily understand that that's not space that they want to venture into. What I think the bigger challenge is that there are people who assume, and who, they used to use the term careerists, like people who I got to move up the ladder no matter what, who probably should not go into leadership, who also raise their hands and basically say, I'm ready for that next role, I'm ready for that next responsibility, but then don't take the time to develop themselves to get ready for it. So I see that as a counterpoint to that particular story. And I probably see more of that than I do people saying, hey, that leadership's probably not for me.
And I think you still, we have some really great leaders in the workplace, and we still have some that maybe that's not their sweet spot. They're great people, and by that I mean I remember a leader actually making this comment to me, and they said, "Well, I don't want to put them in the leadership program because I don't have a leadership position for them, and they'll just leave." And I thought, what? So you're not going to you're not going to train your people. I think that you're missing out on an investment. I would be more concerned that you're not training the people who are going to stay than you are training and developing the people who might leave, right?
And there's a great saying around that. I always muff it up when I try and replicate it, but essentially you just said it. Like to not make the investment in the people is actually the mistake that's being made. And I wonder, because this is an interesting topic, I think, to delve into, the expectation by employers that, it's very transactional. Like, I hired you to do X, Y, and Z. As long as you hit the marks on that, everything's fine. As long as the numbers quarter over quarter are what they're supposed to be, everything's fine. But it's almost like people forget, or entities like businesses forget, that there's a two-way street there. Like, yes, that employee's there doing that thing for you, making you probably gobs of money. There's a return on investment in terms of pouring into that individual. And companies, I think, that understand that see things like very high retention rates. Great. Even the people who depart have nothing but amazing things to say about them. And I think oftentimes we get wrapped around the axle, not really understanding that if you're into people development, you actually should expect your people to move on sometimes. If you can't develop them internally, you should expect for them to move on, because we're all, I think, in a process of maturation. How have you seen that play out in your experience and career?
Well, I think also, I don't want to get too far without saying, I think one of the misses is that the organizations, that's typically one of the first things to get cut if we're looking at budgets. It's an investment, and that's not typically the first place, that we're going to make an investment, right?
It's a line item in OpEx that's easy to remove.
Exactly. But you're 100% right. It has everything to do with retention, which has everything to do with the bottom line, which has everything to do with your client experience. All of it feeds on each other. And, someone who doesn't have the leadership skills or hasn't been really developed as a leader can cost you, and cost you big. I remember doing a kind of a fun short presentation with a board once. It was our bank board, and they're all business owners. And I said, okay, let's do some simple math here. How many exits did you have? Okay, and about how long does it take them to get ramped up? Okay, about what's the average salary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was not a huge organization. They had 500 people. I said, well, it cost you $1.5 million last year.
Yeah, that's a hefty number. That's a hefty number anywhere. I don't care how big the corporation is. When you start talking millions, it's either helping you or it's bothersome to hear that it's negatively impacting.
But I think that too. To your point, will people move on? Yes. And should we applaud them when they do? If we don't have the space for them to do that, yes, we should. We've been fortunate in that we've had people return. They've said, hey, I want to go and see and do, and you've given me this really great toolbox. And now I want to take it and do something, and I'm not sure that I'm going to get that opportunity here. Okay, great. We'll leave the light on for you. And literally, I had someone call me up, and they're still with us now, and they called and they said, can I come home?
Yeah, that's a great sign of culture. I applaud you for that, because that's when someone returns to something. And I completely agree with you, by the way. Sometimes there are opportunities and or just a trajectory that requires you to step outside of your current situation, go get some different experience. And if you have the capacity and there's a willingness on the part of the organization to bring you back, I think that's a good sign, because both sides have determined that they miss certain elements of having that person or that connectivity with the organization, are willing to come back and give it another shot. That's actually a pretty fascinating, I think, testament to the culture that must exist in the organization.
Absolutely.
Because it's all about culture at that point.
Well, and as I've heard you say, and others, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's amazing how that works out. Part of the reason I decided to strike off on my own and establish a consulting firm was that I'd been longing for the entirety of my career to be in a culture that I had significant impact on. In other words, a culture that I built be the place where people are coming to work. And if that culture's failing, then that responsibility falls on me to figure out how to fix that, right? Not necessarily some anomalous entity that exists out there. Like, you join some companies and you may have a great experience, great compensation package, but the culture's just not quite what you want it to be, and then you decide to move on. It's amazing to me how culture ranks very, very high for an individual as they make assessments about like where they want to spend their working time. So it's
100%. And I think that has everything, obviously to do to do with retention. I know we're not necessarily on that subject, but one bleeds in, to the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that where we can't maybe provide that leadership, position in the moment. So again, we're making that investment. They might take that toolbox to another organization, but in our space, we look for I call it gig work opportunities. I might not be able to promote you in title, but I can find challenging project work for you, or I can, put you on a strategic initiative, or you might have a skill set that is going to be great for this thing that MK is working on, that's completely outside of our department. So I think that there are ways in which you can, challenge people and find growth opportunities for them, even if it's not, technically a promotion. But, I'm of the age that, you got your job and you put your head down, and, there was one ladder and it went one direction, and that's how it worked. And it doesn't work that way anymore. It looks more like lattice in today's environment.
So I was telling you before we jumped on the call that I'm developing a new appreciation for HR leaders in the HR space, because it's
Does that mean you didn't have one before, MK?
Let's just say I had a healthy skepticism about HR as an entity, but I'm becoming a fan, which is again, I'm learning through these conversations that I'm having how much responsibility HR, especially HR leaders, have over the journey of people in corporations, and that the journey of the person, which to me is the paramount thing to be concerned with. It's like that to me is like life or death. That is the very most important thing that you can be concentrating on, because if you're concentrating on that, as I tell people time and again, you're going to hit all your numbers. You're going to do all the stuff that you want to do, as long as you're concentrating on your people. And I think sometimes we get that mixed up. We're like concentrating on hitting the numbers, concentrating on shipping, concentrating on, delivering that service that we need to deliver on, and forget about the people. There's a gap that I don't care how hard you press. If you're not including that second component, you're going to be leaving money on the table and or missing out on some opportunity,
Absolutely.
missed opportunity.
Well, we get to play the long game. MK is what I usually like to say, where, perhaps some of our folks who are in production or in other spaces, in the organization, they're to your point, more focused on the short game, and we get to focus on the long game.
Do you find it challenging to have all of those responsibilities roll up to the head of HR?
I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
And
tell us why.
Because
it's a lot.
It is because you get all of it, right? And to your point, it's the entire employee life cycle, and you get to bring people in, maybe to a career that was something that they had never planned, and you get to give them make sure they get all the opportunities for growth. You get to make sure that the organizational architecture is there so that it's set up to be in sync with what you're trying to do, with your people, because the people and the organization have to be in alignment, or it won't work.
Right.
People, comp, all of the things, right, have to all be in alignment, and you've got to understand where your organization is in the life cycle. I've heard you talk about that before. If it's a mature organization or a shrinking organization, or if it's startup, those are all quite different strategies, and that's a lot of fun. Some things that are less fun but very interesting, that provide some learning. In 2020, as an example, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I thought that I'd seen quite a number of things and had the opportunity to do quite a number of things. And in 2020, in January, we were in the middle of an acquisition. We were acquiring another bank. So we were in the middle of that and in the middle of conversion. And here came the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right in the middle of it. And, in that moment, you have 450 people look at you and say, or ownership and say, what are we going to do? And it's kind of just a minute.
Right.
We're going to figure this out, and it's going to be great. And it was, and it wasn't just me. It was, a lot of people that came together. But, to be able to set culture. Go ahead.
Right. No, I was going to say before you go on, another thing strikes me, having now been in the private sector during the pandemic, the HR, the whole thing fell on you guys. The entirety of that experience fell on HR to kind of figure out what the pathway forward was going to be. So, I mean, I guess, from a historical standpoint, that's kind of like your Pearl Harbor, right? I mean, it was a shot to the arm, and it's like, okay, how are we gonna rebound and keep doing what we're responsible for doing?
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
that was a major event for HR leaders.
It was a major event, and you just find yourself in all aspects of people's lives, and you have to, be thoughtful, quite frankly, about making sure, when you do reach a leadership position, as an example, in HR, and even if you're not in a leadership position, that you're careful not to take the human out of human resources. Right?
Sounds simple, but
Sounds simple.
yeah,
Not simple.
yeah, yeah.
Lots of strategy, and we've got to be in alignment. So, the nice thing about that too is, most organizations clearly understand, as you do, that without the people in alignment with the organizational strategy, it's obviously not going to be able to be executed.
Right.
So you have to have HR at the table.
Talk to me a little bit about current state of talent acquisition.
It's
either
interesting.
either in your industry or what you're seeing across the board, because I think most would agree that we're in challenging economic times. That the balance sheets may look right, but that's not the sentiment that people have currently on the landscape. Why is there a disparity? The balance sheets look pretty good, but what people are experiencing right now is not good.
I think there's a concern, about succession, because recruiting has become tight. Now, everyone might say, well, gosh, we're in a little bit different employment market right now, and it's softened a bit. So, we're good to go. The pool from which, everyone was fishing changed after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And everything seems to be dated by the pandemic. And I think everyone thought, well, the tide turns and it all comes back. It's not coming back. Because a lot of things have changed. The way in which people think about work has changed. And that pool will continue to get smaller, has continued to get smaller. And I think that there were also some organizations that did a lot of hiring and really fast and furious, and found out that some of the people they hired couldn't do the work that they hired them to do. The pandemic, and I'm in New York, and I'll hire some cheaper labor in Kansas City,
Right.
as an example, and to come to find out, perhaps that wasn't a good thought. But I think that the expectations for some of our people, who are on the front side or maybe early in their careers, are a bit different. And trying to meet people where they are has become a different type of challenge.
Yeah, people are at home.
People are at home, and it's hard.
That's where you're meeting them.
Well, you're exactly right, and it's difficult to build relationships and to build leadership competencies and do all of the things that we've been talking about, right? If you're not face to face, and someone said, well, we'll get on a Zoom call. That's not the same. I had someone come in my office a couple of years ago, and they said, they said I could work remote, and I'm working remote, and I really like it, but I'm just afraid I'm not going to be the one that, gets that promotion. And they looked at me and waited, for me to say something, and I said, mm-hmm. And that was,
right.
my only response. But I think you said something earlier that makes me want to talk about this a little bit. And it's the speed with which you hire now and the cadence. You talked about going through, 18 interviews, and that's the way it was once done, right? Well, MK has to meet them, and Toni has to meet them, and anyone who's invested in this position has to meet them. Maybe not. If you have the right people in leadership positions, then you have to trust them to hire, really good people. So I think that's also been a big one. I know we have changed significantly using technology, clearly, in different ways, but it's become challenging because if I'm hiring someone who has been in the workplace for decades, they have a different expectation of that life cycle of onboarding than perhaps someone out of college who wants to be CEO in 2 years. as an example.
Yeah.
And to meet people where they are, I think, is a different type of challenge. We hire now more for competencies. Most organizations do now, and that's a little bit different hiring process. We used to hire for tasks. We can teach tasks. I don't know why we ever thought that was a great way to hire people. Now, obviously, you have to have requisite knowledge of, certain things. But while we're talking about knowledge, I also want to say that I'm finding adjustments in organizations with regard to college degree requirements, which I find interesting.
When you say adjustments, qualify that.
So I think let's just use perhaps a lender as an example. I think, historically, you probably would have found a college degree requirement, on that job description. And I don't know that you would now. At least not always. It's preferred. They'll say it's preferred, but from requirement to preferred has been something different. Why do I think that's changing? I don't think that anyone is lowering their standard, clearly, but I do think that we have, and I don't think the numbers show it, we have less and less young people entering college. So what does that look like from a recruiting and hiring space, right? If you have less college graduates, especially with the toolbox that you need them to have.
Not only less and less people entering college, I think we're seeing now a good, healthy amount of examples of people being successful in roles in enterprise without having had the college degree. So that, there's a debate to be had around whether or not, spending that 4 years. And, oh, by the way, I'm a parent who just got my first child through 4 years of a very expensive private school.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Congratulations in a lot of respects. Yeah. Anything for my son, but at the same time, man, it's expensive to send kids to school now. And I don't know that it's absolutely necessary. Like, that's the environment I grew up in. Like, you are going to college no matter what. But again, it's up for debate, and it's a conversation I think that's being had on the landscape around whether or not college degrees are even necessary for some of these roles.
Absolutely necessary, and do not hear me downplay the appreciation for college learning and continued learning. And I would like to think that we're all lifelong learners, but I also know that there's a space, and thinking about education doesn't necessarily equate to intelligence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Years ago, I hired an individual who had a master's in HR, and they were fantastic on paper, and, they were very professional, and over a year and a half couldn't apply it.
Yeah. Yeah, those examples are out there for sure.
Yeah. Now, that's typically not the rule, but right. I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing. I think that we're also seeing non-traditional hires. So I will give you an example. We have an individual who is fantastic, who was, you'll appreciate this, was a CIO at actually one of our competitors, retired. And he said that he got his honeydew list done, and he liked to be around people and wanted something to do. So he came to work with us, doing something completely different than anything he had ever done. And he loves it. Yeah. And it's great because he's flexible. And, so I think that there's also that. Some of the people, especially, again, I hate to keep talking about the pandemic, but the people who might have retired early and said, I'll take this as my time to be, peace out, see you later.
Yeah.
That maybe now have changed their mind. There are some of those people to tap. So I think that who we're looking for is a little bit different. And then I think the way we do it, you talked about when we were talking about the 18, interviews, et cetera. We're very transparent, as an example, about the whole hiring cycle. So from the very first minute, we let everyone know what they can expect. Yeah. And here's what you can expect next. And here's when it will happen. And here's what you can expect next. Even if it's not something they want to hear, I think that you have to be transparent.
I would love to see? I would love for HR teams to have a dashboard of some kind for applicants that basically says, here's where you are in the process. Here's the interviews that you should expect on the timeline, and here's where we're going to make our decision. And when we make that decision, you'll get the answer, and then you're either begin onboarding or you can say thanks and move move on. Like I want to see this on a flow chart,
right,
basically, so that people can be clear on what their expectations should be.
And if we could hold hiring managers to that, I would absolutely do it, MK, from your mouth to God's ears, I guess. That would be fantastic. But I think, with every bit of reasonableness that you can, provide that transparency and help them to understand what it looks like, because that's their first taste of what your culture looks like, is in that hiring and recruiting space. And if that doesn't go well, they're not going to get very far through the process, and they will ghost you. And that's happening, as you I'm sure you're aware, with all organizations, not in a specific industry, not in one specific space. But, if you aren't getting down the road with some of these hires quickly, and some of them you don't want to, you're going to lose out on an opportunity because they've already found another one. Because, again, that pool is small. Right.
You may not realize this, but you actually kicked the door open to something I want to round out our discussion with, and that's the use of technology and its impact on recruiting. Well, what are you seeing? Are you guys using AI in your recruiting process? Has technology been a big leverage point for you? Or are you still super old school, putting stuff up on a chalkboard or something in between?
Well, I would say, I don't know if banking and finance is the most technologically, forward industry in that regard. But yes,
they are from a cybersecurity standpoint. But
we are in that space. So yes, very much.
Okay,
but I would say that as an example, it used to be that if you're posting a position, you're posting the job description. Well, that's a yawn. Okay, here's what we want you to do. Instead, talk about what a day in the life looks like. What are you actually going to do? Those types of things. And we use AI to write some of those that we call a kind of a forward-facing posting. We use text recruiting because we hire a lot of entry-level positions, and those people don't want to get an email. They don't look at their email. You're not going to hire them that way. So we use text recruiting. We use some video recruiting. Again, we're back to that cadence, because I might not be able to get the afternoon off to come sit down with you and your team, but I might be able to go to the coffee shop on my lunch hour and sit down with you on a Zoom call and have a conversation. Right. So those types of things that we're leveraging. We also have some one-way video that we've used where we ask 4 or 5 questions. They can answer them, and they just send the videos in to us. And that's been interesting. Our hiring managers like that. So I think that's been helpful. And then we also, utilize things, some of our data analytics and our HRIS systems, which are really, coming along. Like what? Now we have the ability to dig into our ATS system, which is part of our HRIS, and say, okay, here are some of our top performers. Where did they come from? Did they come from a certain school? Did they come from a certain industry? Yeah. Did they come, okay. And it gives us some of that analytical data to leverage, to go back to some of those places and look. And I think the other thing is, if you're only going to hire into your industry from your industry, so if poaching is your recruitment plan, that's not a good long-term strategy, right? Because you only have 2 ways to get talent. You're going to buy it or you're going to build it. And those are the only 2 ways to do it. And they both take time and effort and money.
You've touched on a topic that I think might be worth maybe another conversation. Maybe I bring together a panel of HR leaders to talk about the analytics associated with hiring. I think you actually just posed an interesting scenario where you can identify what good looks like in terms of what makes the stellar employee, right? How you got them, what's been their trajectory and background. And there's enough data points now where you can kind of maybe replicate that and turn that into a little bit of a science, right?
Absolutely. Because if you think about all of the data points that you have in an HRIS system, right? So you've got their resume, so you've got all their job history, you have their education, you have their skills and certifications and all of that. But those HRIS systems capture a lot of data in addition to their competencies. And how they're graded on their competencies, their performance evaluations, what development, training, all of those types of things that they've received or participated in. our system pulls all of that together as an example, and there's much more than I've talked about here, which will also give you a predictive index and say, based on all of the data points that we have in the system, we think that one of the top successors or the 5 top people for succession for MK are these people in the organization.
Right.
And it will say, here's what we think the likelihood is right now of you retaining those individuals.
Right. Wow.
That's powerful.
Right,
that's powerful.
Someone's going to listen to this and start a whole new company. There's that with AI and what I know about the where AI is going, you could actually build a whole probably industry around this. Wow. Yeah,
absolutely.
And I see application not just in employment hiring, but you can also see maybe some AI application in terms of school admittances. Like that's always been a mystery, right? Like now, since we talked about 4-year education and getting into college, whether or not it's worth the time, effort, and money spent, you can probably actually gather data points from someone's experiences from middle school through high school, and have all of these data points, and now scientifically probably be in a better position to determine whether or not they're going to be successful in a particular college environment, as opposed to what's been a completely human-focused review and decision. And we know that that's not always the fairest way to determine who gets into some of these
because
schools.
if you think about that, even salary histories and all of those things, all of that data that's there, there's a lot of mining to be done, but you have to use it if you're going to mine it, and we're just scratching the surface, with some of that. But the people analytics is a really interesting space, and I think succession planning, leadership development, all of those things are going to sync up and create alignment with all of those. Yeah, it's going to be fantastic to watch.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Any final thoughts about leading? Anything you want to leave the audience with?
I would go back to my comment about, the fact that it's an action and not a title, and, to be that thoughtful about it and be passionate about it, and know that there's not one way to do that. Take all of the things from your personal board of directors, those people that you appreciate and respect and admire, like MK, and others, and think, what can I glean from those individuals? Because I'm here to tell you, MK, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I was brilliant. And now that I'm in my something else, I realize I'm not that smart. And I have.
The older you get, the less you know for certain, is what I like to say.
That is exactly right, and I'm going to use that. And I think that leadership lessons come from a lot of places. And if you don't, board work, volunteerism, at your local Y, or the wrestling team, or whatever the case may be, to take advantage of all of those, because all of those are going to teach you something and give you something to put in your toolbox.
Yeah, it's about the experiences you gather.
Absolutely.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Always
Toni,
a journey.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Again, I think you teased up a couple of things that I might take off to do other subsequent podcasts, but I want to thank you for coming in the studio and having this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, folks, that's it. I appreciate you being here. Folks, that's it for this episode of Amplify, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. We'll see you there next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Amplified, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. If you're ready to elevate your personal leadership and drive your team's success, connect with Apogee Global RMS for custom coaching and development solutions. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode of impactful personal leadership strategies. Until next time, keep leading with purpose and empowering those around you. Together, we'll amplify your success